Canada has a serious drug problem, and it's getting worse by the day. It's not just among those we may think of as typical drug addicts either. An increasingly massive amount of young professionals and working-class Canadians are snorting, injecting, and smoking whatever they can get their hands and noses on, and it's killing them and sending more and more out onto the streets or into a life of crime.
As you see, I got infection everywhere.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
In this video, we're going to take an honest look at the impact that the ongoing drug addiction and overdose crisis is having on Canada. How much does it cost the economy, and what are the spillover costs and impact of this crisis? How can it be addressed effectively? Canada is gripped by one of the worst drug addiction crises on the planet. Around 21% of Canadians will experience addiction during their lifetime. The majority of substance use costs are attributed to alcohol and tobacco, followed by opioids, cannabis, and prescription drug abuse. Opioids in particular are fueling a massive overdose crisis. Between January 2016 and June 2023, there were more than 40,600 opioid overdoses and thousands more from other drugs. Last year alone, there were 3,970 opioid overdose deaths, averaging 22 per day. The majority of these deaths occurred in British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario, with a 5% increase compared to the same period in 2022. Emergency medical services responded to over 20,000 suspected opioid-related overdoses in the first half of 2023 alone, predominantly among males aged 20 to 49, with dangerous fentanyl involved in 84% of fatal overdoses. Multi-drug toxicity, particularly with stimulants, also contributes to the crisis, with people mixing opioids, cocaine, meth, and other drugs in deadly ways. The cost of the drug crisis on Canada's system is enormous. It was already costing the system over $46 billion in 2017, and the cost has steadily risen since then. This includes expenses related to healthcare, criminal justice, and lost productivity. Drug addiction costs Canada around $50 billion per year and leads to higher healthcare costs, legal costs, and productivity losses. The primary contributors to these costs are alcohol and tobacco, accounting for more than 2/3 or $14.6 billion and $12 billion respectively. Opioids and cannabis follow, with costs totaling $3.5 billion and $2.8 billion respectively. For employers, the cost of substance abuse on an organization is devastating, with a recent Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addiction, or CCSA, report estimating that lost productivity alone costs $589 per person. That culminates in a loss of $22.4 billion over 1 year in productivity losses to Canadian businesses. Rich Jones, Executive Director of Heritage Cares, revealed that 26% of employees are either struggling with addiction or going home to active addiction. Our estimates show not only how substance use affects the healthcare and criminal justice systems, but also the ability of people in Canada to work and contribute to the economy, notes Emily Bigger, CCSA research and policy analyst. High drug use has also fueled Canada's rising crime rate, with massive busts barely making a ripple in national news reports. One recent bust in mid-January in Manitoba netted the largest narcotic seizure in the history of the Canadian prairies, when over $50 million in meth was seized at the Beausevan border crossing. The haul, weighing over 406 kilograms, more than 895 pounds, and equivalent to 4 million doses of the mind-wrecking, body-destroying substance, was discovered in a semi-trailer bound for Winnipeg on January 14 and being driven by the 29-year-old suspect. The sole driver of the truck was arrested and faces charges related to drug trafficking. RCMP say the drugs were destined for distribution across Manitoba, Western Canada, and potentially Ontario. Police emphasized the link between large illicit drug shipments and increased community violence, highlighting the importance of the seizure in enhancing public safety. It's worth keeping in mind that many of Canada's provinces have some of the most lax drug laws in the world regarding personal use of controlled substances. From January 31, 2023 to January 31, 2026, adults in British Columbia found in possession of up to 2.5 grams of opioids, cocaine, methamphetamine, or MDMA are exempt from criminal charges or drug seizure. Minister. Layla Goodridge, Conservative Shadow Minister for Addictions, and Stephen Ellis, Conservative Shadow Minister for Health, recently commented on BC's one-year anniversary of decriminalizing, noting that its undeniable failure is clear. While overdoses went up, the street prices of hazardous drugs have plummeted by 70 to 95%. Shockingly, drugs now surpass crime, accidents, and disease combined as the leading cause of death in British Columbia. The Liberal NDP coalition, however, persists in exacerbating this crisis. Recently, the British Columbia NDP government, supported by Justin Trudeau's Liberals, even entrusted the British Columbia Centre on Substance Abuse, or BCCSU, to authorize clinicians to prescribe dangerous fentanyl to minors under the pretext of safe supply. Alarmingly, these vulnerable youths can receive these perilous drugs without parental notification. Due to the policies implemented by the Liberal NDP alliance, overdoses and fatalities continue to surge uncontrollably. Poilievre and the Conservatives claim that their common-sense conservatives will stop drugs and treat addiction effectively, instead of enabling it under fake compassionate big government programs. How do Canadians feel about the addiction crisis and drug legalization? According to a survey done by Canada's Privy Council Office, 88% of Canadians want their friends or family members who use drugs to feel comfortable discussing it with them, while 81% have empathy for people struggling with substance use. 62% believe decriminalization would improve access to health and social services, but 51% think it would increase harms associated with substance use. Despite these liberal views, the surging homeless population is evidence against this softer view. Many drug addicts end up on the streets, with around a quarter of homeless stating that addiction was what led them to originally losing their home. The fact of the matter is that safe injection sites and lessening penalties on individual drug use is only fueling addiction. It's also offering an even bigger incentive for drug dealers to ship their deadly wares across the border and flood Canadians' streets with poison. Every overdose and addiction that's happening in Canada is affecting a real person. Each life lost represents a profound loss to families and communities nationwide. What is the Trudeau government's plan apart from legalizing drugs and giving the green light to far-left provinces to let their cities and towns turn into needle-strewn zombie theme parks? Well, their plan is to reduce the stigma around drug use and make it more socially acceptable to admit to using drugs or being addicted to drugs. Yes, seriously. The Trudeau government recently launched a revitalized Canadian drugs and substances strategy that prioritizes addicts' lived experiences and especially aimed at addressing the impact on marginalized groups, including Indigenous and Black communities, due to historical trauma. To reduce stigma, the Substance Use and Addictions Program, or SUAP, supports projects such as the Beyond Stigma Public Education Program. According to the official Government of Canada website, these initiatives aim to educate healthcare providers and the public while addressing colonialism and institutional racism's impact on stigma for Indigenous peoples with opioid use disorders. Additionally, they are focusing on providing a continuum of culturally appropriate services, including treatment, harm reduction, and recovery support. In other words, they are injecting more big-budget dollars into woke nonsense and displaying the typical racist, patronizing attitude towards minorities under the guise of compassion. An Indigenous drum circle isn't going to do much for anyone when they're strung out on meth and prices for street drugs are at all-time lows to feed their addictions. The lived experiences of a Black cocaine addict in inner-city Toronto aren't going to mean much at all if he or she is literally dead from a drug overdose in a week. This is the absolute insanity of the Trudeau Liberal administration, driving Canada into the ground with record homelessness, inflation, cost of living burdens, and radical left-wing green socialism, while whining and cooing about ridiculous far-left cultural Marxism that is a complete insult to Canadians of every ethnic and political background. For his part, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre promises to address drug addiction more effectively and stop the lax attitude toward drugs.
This Prime Minister spent $100 million handing out free drugs to addicts. He has led to a 300% increase in overdoses.
But even when it comes to Poilievre's remarks, so far all Canada has in promises since he's still the opposition. What's clear is that the Trudeau way of doing things is leaving a lot of Canadians in body bags, psychiatric hospitals, jail cells, or on the streets. What's clear is that Canada's already sky-high taxes and crumbling healthcare system simply can't handle the addiction crisis, especially when you add in 500,000 immigrants per year flooding the system and drugs being cheaper and more available than ever during a time of despair. It's no exaggeration to say that Canada is entering a perfect storm, a horrific, truly disturbing disaster. The country has lost its mind, led by Prime Minister Blackface and his troop of absurd, power-hungry neo-Marxists, and their fake, compassionate ideology of coddling minorities with pandering, patronizing rhetoric. These dangerous individuals are continuing to let Canadians die by the thousands, particularly young men who should have a bright future ahead of them. In Trudeau's Canada, more and more men aren't just being told they're evil for being white males, they're being ushered to an early grave in a country without hope and without any real action to stop dangerous drug traffickers and get addicts off drugs instead of coddling and enabling them. The years of lockdowns and far-left propaganda are combining with rising housing costs, the mass immigration influx, and growing despair to create a rising overdose and addiction crisis. Trudeau and his minions don't care. They just want to continue their mission to get everybody to use the right pronouns and feel compassion for those suffering. What about real action? What about extreme, severe consequences for traffickers of dangerous drugs that are responsible for the deaths of so many? What about stopping the promotion of cannabis and other substances and lies that they are harmless when they are demonstrably linked to erratic behavior, psychosis, and early-onset schizophrenia? What about if Canada went back to being a country with basic sanity and not a degenerate hellhole full of drug-addled, miserable people being enabled by Big Brother Justin? It's time to get real. The addiction crisis is far too big of a strain on the healthcare system, the economy, Canadian families, and society as a whole. It's killing far too many people who are suffocated and killed by the sick, low expectations and condescending elitism of Trudeau and his sleazy cabinet of opportunists. Take a quick look at what happens when the shoe is on the other foot. When China convicted 36-year-old Canadian Robert Schellenberg of drug smuggling 5 years ago, they didn't send him to jail for a small vacation or give him therapy. They sentenced him to death. Now, we can argue about China's sentence and the clear problems with its justice system. Schellenberg maintains he was framed and never smuggled any meth into China. He may well be telling the truth considering China's grotesque communist system and complete fraud of a judiciary system. But the point of harsh penalties still applies even as a deterrent. We can also see that China has nowhere near the problem with drug addiction that Canada does. For his part, former U.S. President Donald Trump also agrees with the death penalty for dealers.
That's right, no drug problem. I said, what do you attribute that to? Death penalty, quick trial.
Let's be honest, drug dealers are scum. They are murderers. They are as bad as rapists and school shooters. They should be spit on and scorned every square inch of ground they traverse. They need to face very, very serious consequences. Canada needs to fix its problem and start with a complete reversal of the soft-on-crime liberal idiocy that's gripped this nation and grown over the past 4 decades or so. Canada needs to change course. Now. Not a single person more should die from the failed far-left drug policy that has brainwashed the nation and is crashing our economy and society. If you like this video and want to learn more about what's really going on in Canada, check out this video here. And if this video brought value to you today, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing the video. Thanks for watching.